So it is my privilege today to have as a guest Lindy Ledohowski. She earned her PhD in English, focusing on contemporary Canadian literature and ethnic identity politics from the University of Toronto. She did a postdoc at the University of Ottawa, and she's done a whole bunch of other interesting things that we're going to hear about. But most notably, she is the founder of a really awesome EdTech startup called EssayJack, and she is the inaugural CEO of that startup. So Lindy, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, my pleasure, Chris. Thanks for inviting me. I never know if I have anything interesting to say, but I'm happy to tell everybody my story.
I think you, based on experience, you always have something interesting to say.
I have something to say, then it's up to you to decide.
You have something to say. Yeah, that's right. Interesting, I suppose it's subjective, but it's always been very interesting to me. So we first met, and we were just trying to figure out when we last first met in person, and I think it was around January. We had lunch in Ottawa. I was still working for the government, and I had just started Roostervane at that point, but it was getting a little bit of traction. And I was just so excited when we met. I loved hearing your story, and I was just so excited and inspired that there was somebody who had left a Tenure-Track Professor job and gone and started up a company. And I thought, this is amazing. This is something, I didn't know PhDs were doing this. And to this day, you are, I think, the only humanities PhD that I've ever met who has taken that path. So maybe my enthusiasm, thinking that I had found a new subspecies of PhDs, was a little premature. But it is so great to have you here, and I'm just really excited to share your story. Well, for you to share your story with the audience. I know it's fantastic and inspiring and all that good stuff. So I'm wondering if we can just dive right in, and if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about you as the academic, which must be, it's a few years in the background now, but.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting, so I finished my PhD in 2008, got a postdoc right away, and then by 2009, had a tenure-track job. So I had a 2-year postdoc. I had to lose the last year of it in order to take the tenure-track job. So what's interesting in some of that is I now feel like, oh, well, my story is like 10 years old. So is it really going to be relevant to people who are newly on this sort of post-academic journey these days? And I feel like the part that's important, and hopefully, and this is from the chat from Jen, because the part that's important is that, so 2008 was the financial crisis, and the entire world and the academy was crumbling. And while the context now is very different, the job market and the way people feel about it, I think, is very much the same. And so when I was leaving my tenure-track job, there was a lot of verbiage around but you need to be grateful, you landed a job, you'll never get another one, all of that. And that, I think, is very similar in today's context, sort of today, even though it's 10 years ago. So that's, as I say, it's 10 years ago, but I think, a pandemic is not so radically dissimilar
Yeah, it's very relevant.
A giant financial crisis when it comes to a very, very bleak outlook. And so I like to be able to share my story, which isn't bleak, to people. But to go back to your question, which was so tell me about yourself as an academic. So as an academic, so I'm a literary scholar by training. My area of expertise is Canadian literature, or CanLit, as we like to call it in the biz. So I'm a contemporary CanLit scholar, and my area of expertise is particularly contemporary Canadian literature, and as you mentioned, looking at identity politics. So what that means is, what do we think about when we think about what it means to be Canadian in today's Canada, particularly as it pertains to questions around diversity and ethnic identity? So that's the kind of stuff that I wrote about, and even still do write about the odd time as a full-fledged scholar. So that's, and again, Lindy the academic, I first started publishing while I was still in my PhD. And so by the time I was on the job market and with the postdoc, I did have a few peer-reviewed publications under my belt, and continued to do some of that publication even once I quit my tenure-track job.
So you have, like, as you alluded to in your introduction, I mean, you've got the dream, right?
Yeah,
The tenure
yeah,
track job, and like the thing that everybody, and I mean just about everybody, is chasing. The vast majority of the PhDs that I work with, both statistically and just anecdotally from my conversations, people expect to be tenure track professors, right?
yeah.
Um, and I, one of the things when you first told me your story that struck me was that you had kind of an epiphany, I guess you could call it, maybe. I mean, so maybe tell us a little bit about like what that tenure track professor job was like, and maybe some of the things that led you on your journey to eventually leaving that, you know, quote unquote dream job.
Yeah, and what I want to make clear is, like, I too wanted to be a professor. You know, that was the expectation.
Mm.
That's what I worked towards. So, um, you know, and I never thought of myself as being particularly gifted or particularly smart when it came to academics. So I knew if I was going to be competitive, I needed to work really hard and have a good track record and all of those things. And that's something I really wanted. And prior to finishing my PhD, I had been teaching at the University of Toronto. So for 3 years of my PhD was about 4.5 years. So for 3 years of that, I taught full-time at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus while working on my dissertation as well. And so I felt that I had a good handle on that mix of the research piece and the teaching piece, and I really liked it. So getting that job was fantastic. I'm not a religious person, but the night of my campus visit at the University of Waterloo, I was like in the shower at the hotel, and I was like, oh, please let me get this job. Please let me get this job. So I do want to make it clear that I'm not, you know, it's not as though I didn't want it and just sort of reluctantly landed into the job. And then secondly, the job is a good job. So the University of Waterloo is, you know, it's a good university. And I was at a smaller campus, St. Jerome's University within the University of Waterloo. So I had small classes, I had good colleagues, you know, so all of those things that you think you want when you dream about that tenure track job, like arguably I had them. And so I want to make that clear, because it's easy to think when you hear, you know, the odd story of people who leave, you think, oh, well, maybe they never really wanted to be a professor in the first, or maybe they weren't good enough, or maybe, you know, they were in, I don't know, like Timbuktu or something, you know, like it. So I think it's important to say you can get all the things that you think right, but the lived experience of that still might not fit. And in my case, I didn't know it until I had it, so to speak. So for me, there were two I guess maybe three principal variables that didn't live up to what I wanted. So the first typically was that I had the two-body problem. So my husband is also an academic, and he had a tenure track, but at the time had a tenure track job at Carleton University. So University of Waterloo and Carleton are a 5-hour drive apart. And I had, from the very beginning, for my campus visit and interviews, I had made it clear that I had an academic spouse, and that was going to be something that had to be on the table for us to kind of muddle our way through. So that was kind of thing number one that made things weird. Thing number two, Kitchener-Waterloo is a lovely little place, but it's a bit weird. You know, my partner and I, we didn't necessarily fit, and I don't want to say anything bad about the university or the town itself, but let's just say it's not particularly diverse. My husband is a person of color, and we felt that there in ways that both of us coming from Toronto hadn't experienced. So that was another thing that made us start to think, is this a place that we could really live, you know, for the rest of our life? And the third piece is probably the most important, which is, and it really just depends on your personality. In my case, you know, my chair sat me down, and I can see it clear as day. We were sitting in the cafeteria at St. Jerome's University, and I had my coffee, and he came and joined me. He's like, you know what, just, you know, I want you to settle in, and I want you to be happy, and you have enough published that you don't need to have a lot of anxiety about tenure. You know, when the time comes, you know, you'll be fine for tenure. So just kind of enjoy this starting out part of your career. And it was really kind of him to say that. And I know the motivation why he said that, But in that moment, I sort of had this like kind of sweat down my back where I started to think, so I know exactly what my life is going to look like for the next 40 years. I know where I'll be living. I know who I'll see every day at work. I know exactly what my earning potential is going to be year over year. And so for somebody like me, where, because I didn't think I was the smartest or the most gifted, so I needed to sort of build these goals and kind of challenge myself. And all of that was gone. And so for me, that was very unsettling. And I know for some people that would be very comforting, but for me, I was like, oh, so now there's absolutely nothing I can do to change the conditions of my work, whether it's the location, place, the getting my husband, the even just challenges to myself. There's kind of nothing I can do. So that's a bit of the kind of landscape of what it was like for me as a young and new tenure track prof, and when the shine started to come off that penny.
It's really interesting. And how many years into it did you say it was?
Yeah, so I lasted 2 years before I was like,
You lasted 2 years, yeah.
done, see ya.
You lived the dream for 2 years, and then so what came next after that? I mean, where do you go? And I think there's a lot of people, even though not all of us get tenure track jobs. I certainly didn't, but you ended up plunging into the thing that a lot of people go through when they leave academia, which is, where do you go next? What do you do?
Yeah, and I think why I like to tell my story is partially because I think, as you rightly said, so it was my good fortune that I happened to land a tenure track job. And so I got to like live that experience that maybe it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And some other people statistically won't have the good fortune of sort of actually landing that job and then feeling whether it is or isn't a good fit. And so it's way easier to think, oh, well, if I'd only had landed that job, my life would have been this, this, and this. And I'm very lucky now because I don't ever look back and go, oh, well, what if I was just a professor? Then I could have this or this or that. Even in, my down days now, I don't ever go, oh, but if I was a professor, I would have X or Y, because I know exactly what that life would look like. Whereas had I never had it, it's very easy to kind of have that grass is always greener. And so for some folks I can't stress this enough. It's just bad luck. Like there's nothing necessarily merit-based that determines why one person lands a tenure track job and another person doesn't. Like it's just, and I've been on hiring committees, I can just guarantee you it is no reflection of your capabilities if it just so happens that you don't land a tenure track job. And I think it's important to think that whatever comes next isn't plan B, and plan A is this always wonderful thing of being a professor. Because I can tell you, had it happened, I don't know, in some magical alternate universe, if, my partner and I both landed jobs, I don't know, at the University of Toronto, and we got to live in a city we liked, or I can't even imagine what that imagined other world would be, then yeah, being a professor is fantastic. But you can never kind of know exactly if those details you open with my department and my university, and they're very kind and all the rest. And I, made it clear that, because everybody was saying both at Carleton and at Waterloo, they're going, oh, well, you're both so good, it'll just work out. I'm like, yeah, but there's a lot of life that happens in the it'll just work out. It could work out in 5 years or 10 years, whatever. And, I didn't marry this person so that I could live for 10 years having a weekend marriage. I mean, that wasn't my vision of my life. And so for me, when I left through a stutter step. So I first got a grant, which kind of bought myself out of a year. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to go and work on this research project for a year. And it can be a tester to see if you can come up with something plausible as an offer that, we can sort of go for. And of course, they're like, oh, well, we could get like a part-time research position for him. I'm like, well, thanks, but no thanks. But anyway, so then when I left, I honestly didn't know what I was going to do. So I started off first doing consulting. And so consulting is just this catch-all phrase, which is like, I have a brain, I will do whatever you need me to do. And I will find some kind of way of making you pay me for that. And so that was everything from, editing to workplace training. I did diversity training because, as I said, as an academic, I worked on identity politics in contemporary Canada. So there are There are like diversity and equity questions that you can explore in literary arts. And those can also be workplace questions if you stretch that a little bit. And if you then decide, okay, well, there are these workplaces and they may care about sort of diversity and equity and hiring practices and what that looks like. I was sort of researching, so what's that about and what can I offer in that space? So that's what I did at first. And what was really fantastic about that experience of doing consulting for a little bit was that I learned how to charge for my time and effort. So to not just work for free. And that didn't always come easily. So as an academic, you get trained to do a ton of stuff for free. You know, like even after I quit, I was still, because I was supervising a student and she hadn't yet finished, and she had about 6 months left, and it didn't make sense for me to pass her project on to somebody else and all this. So I just finished supervising her for free for 6 months. And at the time, as an academic, that made total sense. I mean, that's what you do. You have this academic obligation. But if you ask anybody else in any other job to just work for free for another 6 months on a project, you know, like it's laughable, it's ridiculous. But, you know, you do peer review for free, you supervise, you know, there are all these things that you get trained to do for free, so that then as a consultant, for me to really have to say like, no, I need to allocate time and money for everything. So that was a really important learning for me. The second really important learning from that moment when I was doing consulting was confidence in my own ability. Because the other thing that I think happens to lots of academics, it certainly happened to me, was I wasn't all that confident. I felt I don't know anything about the rest of the world at all. And everybody I know has PhDs. Anything I can do, everybody can do. I don't have a lot of work experience, you know, all of those sorts of insecurities sort of came into play. So being a consultant and finding myself have to be in businesses and say, you know, here's how I can help you do what you do better, and then deliver upon that and have people pay and be grateful and be happy and see the value in what I was able to do, helped bolster that sense of confidence. So in the post sort of academic moment for people leaving the tenure track, either by force or by choice, I do think like getting out there and getting a job, getting consulting, like just get whatever the gigs are, part of it is to help build up that confidence, even if the thing that you're doing isn't necessarily what you want to do, you know, forever. I think that confidence boost is really helpful. And I think because I had that consulting phase between being an academic and what I do now, it gave me that confidence to get into educational technology. And as you said at the beginning, you know, there aren't a lot of humanities PhDs who get into tech startup worlds. Like even in the tech startup world, there are a lot of, you know, people who have academic credentials, often in like engineering sciences or sometimes mathematics and some of the other more hard sciences. But there aren't a lot of like English PhDs being, you know, okay, let's start a tech company. And I think I will probably say it was that bit of consulting in between that gave me that extra bit of confidence. Be like, okay, I figured that out. I can figure this out.
Yeah. So I want to come back to that consulting, because it's really interesting. And I know it's something that a lot of PhDs get told, and it's kind of the alt-ac advice is, well, you can be a consultant. And there are so many questions with that. And you've alluded to a lot of them. The one thing that strikes me that you said is the value thing. And I know like when both of my jobs that I worked, had I not worked those jobs, I wouldn't actually have a sense of how valuable my abilities are. And when you can write a report at a quality that, you know, your colleagues, it takes them 2 weeks to do something you can do in a day or whatever, you know, those types of things, if you don't really see that, you don't really know how to bring it into the marketplace. So it's just kind of really interesting that confidence that you're talking about, that's actually really hard to get. But I wanted to pause in the consulting, because as you mentioned, it is like a catch-all term, and one that gets thrown around a lot. And sometimes it refers obviously to, you know, like the McKinsey or the BCGs or whatever, the PhDs can go and consult for them. But for like thinking of doing consulting with their PhD, I'm wondering if you could like break down a little bit of how you went about doing that, like just a few of
and I
steps
think
you took and kind of sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, like, I think because it's probably right to differentiate between becoming a consultant with a firm versus starting off consulting on your own. And I think with a firm is much more akin to like getting a job, and which is really valuable, and you can learn valuable skills as a consultant in that vein. If you become a consultant and you're basically self-employed, it's in some ways more demanding because you have to figure out everything. And so in my case, so I began, basically just sort of thinking, okay, well, what are the things actually that I can do? Okay, obviously writing and editing are at the top of the list. I had been a high school teacher before and taught as a university professor, so I felt pretty confident in my abilities around education. So those were kind of three areas where I started. And then honestly, at the beginning, it was like I just networked like you wouldn't believe. I mean, this advice isn't going to work so much in a pandemic, although it does kind of, because I think networking is in some ways even easier now that everybody is virtual. It's kind of easier to get a virtual coffee than it can sometimes be to get a real life coffee with somebody. But I mean, any wine and cheese in my town I went to, any event, my bank was hosting an event, I was at the bank, it was like an open house shop, like one of the shops in the neighborhood was having like an open house sale, invited for the neighbors. I was there and I was shaking hands with all the neighbors. Our neighbors had a street party. I was like, I'm going to the street party, and part of it was just because you don't know who knows whom. And so I found just telling as many people as possible that you're starting consulting, and then you sort of describe the sort of, like I would describe like, oh, so I do editing, so that can be, corporate annual reports. And I mean, I was basically just kind of, these are the things that I know writing that happen in businesses. So I'll say I can do that. And then it grew from there. And I actually I have a handful of clients that I did pick up back in that consulting phase that I do work for still to this day. Once a year, they'll have one sort of project, and it's very easy for me to do, and it's a way that I can keep like a finger in that organization and sort of see what they're up to, and it's just kind of rewarding and it's fun. And, so I got enough sort of clients emerging from that. Often it would be sort of around editing or writing, and then it would grow from there. So sometimes if it was like an editing project that came to me and it was just sort of, here's a document, can you edit it? I would. And then I'd make some sort of proposal. Like on the back of that, I'd be like, you know what? I'd love to come and do a brown bag lunch session on business writing for your staff. Do you do stuff like that? Do you have, additional training sessions like that or whatever? And I'll be like, I'll do the first one for free. It'll be great. Just, you can see what I can do and whatever. And most of the time they would say yes. And then I would go and I'd make up some, 45-minute session on what constitutes good business, right? I mean, I shouldn't say I made it up. I mean, obviously, as academics, you can do research. So I did the research and sort of figured out how to package something that would be of genuine value. And then from that, I used it as an opportunity to also find out about that organization. So what were their strategic priorities? What were their needs? What were their gaps? And then I'd be able to think if there was something else that I could propose that could be monetized. And so that's how like editing then turned into some of the diversity consulting, because, you start off, it's like, okay, I'll just edit this piece of paper. And you edit their, copy edit their piece of paper. And then from there you get in and you kind of get to know the organization a bit. Like now, that I've been outside the academy, like there's a process for this that would be called like the discovery phase. So if you hire a consultant or a contractor as a business, often the first thing that they do is they come in and they do a discovery phase, which is they find out what your business is into, and then you get the proposal and you follow along with the project. So like now with my EdTech company, if we're going to do a graphic design project or something, or a branding project, the company would come and they do a discovery, and of course they would charge us for that. And then they would come up with a proposal. At the time, I didn't know any of this. Like all of that was an absolute like black hole of ignorance. But I knew intuitively that in order for somebody to want to pay me a little bit more than like a copy editing fee, I had to, figure out what made them tick and then see if there was something of value that I could offer them. And then related to that, so that's the process, that, you know, get in with something, try to offer value and learn about them, and then make some sort of proposal that might fit. And then throughout all of that is also figuring out like pricing, and how do you price yourself, or, you know, provide costing for things. So there are a couple of different ways. Again, in an editing, typically, you know, you've got like a per word or per page. And then with other types of consulting contracts, it's often hourly. Now for me, because I figured I could do work quickly and efficiently, so I didn't want to do the hourly, because if I, you know, said, oh, okay, well, that'll only, you know, take me 5 hours, I charge them for 5 hours, and where's the benefit in that? Whereas if I gave them a project price and a start date and the end date of the project, and the project might be 2 weeks, I might only spend 5 hours on it, but the entire project is like a 2-week envelope with deliverables, and I'm charging for the those deliverables, whatever they may be, whether it's a report or presentation or recommendations, whatever, maybe a combination of those sorts of things. So that's how I would do it. I used as a baseline in terms of thinking about hourly rates. So I came up with like an hourly rate and also a per diem rate. And then, as I say, like project that I would just sort of, so I was making it all up as I went along. But I pegged like hourly rates and per diem rates on average legal rates. So obviously lawyers, depending on what level you are, whether you're a junior articling lawyer all the way up to a senior partner in a firm, the rates are different. But you can find what those rates are, the average rates in your city. You can just do a Google search and find those average legal hourly rates. And so that I kind of pegged myself just, you know, sort of just below that average. And that was also, again, important in terms of that confidence building, so that I could feel like it was reasonable to require a reasonable level of compensation for what I had to offer. And if people weren't willing to pay that, then they weren't the right clients for me, and that I had to kind of stick to that a little bit. So that was, you know, the thinking that went into that process.
That's awesome. There's so much good stuff in there. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want to get onto where you're at now. But just to like pull out a couple little threads that were super interesting. The first is I love the putting yourself out there. Were you in Waterloo at this point or back in Ottawa?
No, so I was in Ottawa.
You were in Ottawa, yeah. And it's so, I mean, I think the introverts watching this are probably having a heart attack right now, because it's like, oh God, go to the opening of some random store and talk to people, and like it's it's really intimidating, and at the same time, but even for you, and I think you're if I don't know, are you an introvert or an extrovert? I shouldn't assume. I don't know.
I know I'm like the classic
there, right?
Combination of both. Like I can do the extroverted thing and come across very extroverted, but I need my quiet time to recharge.
Yeah. That's I'm very similar, and it's interesting. I had the same experience when I came to Ottawa, and just having to go and just step so far out of your comfort zone and meet people and pretend that you knew what you were talking about when you actually, I don't know if you did. I definitely had no clue what I was talking about half the time, but just trying to learn, you know. And it's interesting even now as I reflect on those, that there were some ridiculous meetings that I had, and it was like to be a realtor, to be like all these like random things. But I learned so much about the world by doing it, and about how I was perceived, and even about kind of some of the things you're talking about bring your skills. So I love that. So those two things of like, first of all, not being afraid to put yourself out there, whatever that looks like. And I think maybe for some people in the digital age now that we're all in because of the pandemic, there may even be slightly easier ways to do this now, or at the very least, there are digital applications of it. If you're really terrified to go stand in a room with people, you can reach out on LinkedIn, you can attend online events, even like this one or whatever. But yeah, those two things of putting yourself out there and like learning as you go, like it's so fantastic. And presumably when you stepped into your first meeting, like you didn't know like, this is my value proposition, you know, you probably had a sense of what it could be, but you're kind of you're just jumping in and figuring out as you go along. Right?
Well, and this is where like, at least for me, the
Yeah,
doctoral
it's just
experience was really helpful because, like, I began the PhD. I mean, I thought I knew what I was going to write about, but I didn't know until I wrote it. So the experience of just trundling forward anyway,
yeah.
even in not feeling confident, I carried that with me in the post-academic experience.
That's awesome. So that's I think those are some really great nuggets for people thinking about consulting, because if you think about it as this perfect, like, I have a cut and dry package, I know what it is, and I'm going to go and offer it to the world, like, you might never get there. But when you kind of start networking and kind of figure out, and people say, oh yeah, we need somebody to write a report for us, I'm like, yeah, I could probably do that. I could probably figure it out. And so those are the experiences I think are so valuable and help kind of in that formation of your post-academic self, really. So what was it like as you're going through this consulting career? It obviously, I remember you telling me before, like, the consulting was going pretty well. So where did the journey kind of take you that you ended up thinking, I'm going to go from, this kind of freelance consultant to an EdTech startup? How did that happen?
Yes. So I made a mistake when I started consulting, and I'll share this with all of you. So my mistake was that my consulting brand, such as it is, was Lindy Ledohowski PhD. So that's what I had to offer. And that was great, but it meant that as I started to have more work than I could just do myself in hours of the day and days of the week, and I would try to, like, bring on assistants, ultimately, because so much of the brand was me, any clients that I had built up a relationship with, if I was like, hey, here's this assistant, she's going to do your project, they were resistant to that. It was kind of like, well, no, like, we hired you to do this. We want you to be the one to deliver on this project. And so I had run into a problem of scalability where I was not scalable. There are only so many me's out there. And because I had created this brand around me, I realized, like, I could work, I could work Monday to Friday, forever. And I could probably continue to drum up enough work that, I could, the income was sort of, there were very busy times and very not so busy times when it came to cash flow, but overall on an annual basis, it was fine. And I could have kept on doing that forever, but I could never grow. And so then I started to have this moment where I was like, oh, okay, well, this is a service-based business that I'm now running. I mean, I was very new to thinking of what I was doing in business terms. So I was like, this is a service-based business. I need to somehow get into a product-based business where the product can go and it can then scale outside of me. And so that was really, I think, as I started to think about, what the next step was going to be in that product. I don't know, it could have been shoes, books, whatever it was going to be. And then it so happened that my husband, who at that time had, become an assistant and associate professor, so he was tenured, and we were still talking about, and again, even in my consulting, I was dealing with writing, and we were just talking about the fact that, students can't write. And it's this perennial problem, and you can essentially spend your entire life kind of like, kids can't write. And so then we started to sort of say, yeah, but there's probably technology out there that can help. And then as I was doing research into, like, what are the technologies that are really in the writing space, both, that maybe I can use as a consultant, or that maybe I can think about as I'm starting to think in terms of product, there wasn't what we were really looking for. So then we just sort of like, well, how hard is it to build? And so that kind of started us on what is now the EssayJack journey. And we're coming up September 1st. It's 5 years since we launched a very shaky beta product in the market. And by 2019, we have now like a fully, integrated institutional product. It integrates with Blackboard and Canvas and D2L. It has Google OAuth sign-in, so you can sign directly in with your Gmail. It has educator accounts, student accounts, automatic feedback, all kinds of things in it. But at its core, awesome. It began its life as a tool to help students write essays. So it sort of breaks the writing process down into small, manageable chunks. that take away the anxiety, and it gives tips and prompts, and it just does that through technology.
And the funny question, I know the answer to this question, but I was going to say kind of funnily, like, so you went and learned computer programming, right? And you went and learned how to do apps, and you learned Ruby on Rails. So the answer for people watching, I think, is no. That, I mean, you probably do a lot of those things, sort of, but.
Yeah, and I used to, at the beginning, like every time I'd be talking to like a bank about like a bank loan or something like that, and I'd be saying, well, I'm not the technical person, but, I have all this domain expertise when it comes to writing and teaching in the education space. And then over time, people have said, well, actually, Lindy, you need to stop saying that you're not the technical person, because you've now got 5 years under your belt, which is quite technical. So again, like I myself don't write code, but I sure as heck understand our code when I look at it with our developers. I understand the EssayJack architecture, how it's built, the things that are important. I know way more than I needed to know about cloud hosting and various different front end and back end languages, all of that. And like, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I mean, certainly if you had asked me while I was doing my PhD, if I was ever like, I am seriously the least technologically savvy person on the planet. I was a holdout. I didn't even want a cell phone, and like, who needs a smartphone? I don't need to check my email when I'm out and about. I was just not. I'm not
the one I can flip up.
Yeah, like I'm happiest with like a book, and a cup of coffee, but I think going outside your comfort zone is also really helpful and really important.
So it's like, it's that transformation that's starting that I'd love to hear more about too, that obviously going from consultant, where you think about doing everything yourself, to going to turning into a CEO, where all of a sudden you're not actually doing all the work per se, the work, quote unquote yourself, but you're building a machine basically. So how did you kind of make that transition? Like, was it a tough transition? Did it just come really easily, or what was that like?
Yeah, so I'm still in that transition. So I'll admit that, so one of the good things about not being a coder and starting a technology business is, by definition, you have to delegate a huge task to other people. So that was a really good learning in terms of how to set up systems and structures to allow other people to build what was essentially, my vision, our vision. And be able to kind of test it along the way. So one of the things I took from the academy was peer review. So because at the early stages, like I couldn't tell whether it was good code, bad code, or whatever. So we would bring in people and like external third parties to do a review of the code. And I learned about code documentation and all of those sorts of things to build frameworks around how to delegate in that realm. And then as we've grown, there are other things that emerge beyond the technical piece of EssayJack. So there's marketing, and there's human resources, and there's payroll, and that kind of stuff. And then along the way, I've learned how to delegate some of those pieces to other people and then have structures for them. So, okay, the bookkeeper does this, and this is the process for how she and I work together. Or, the digital marketer does this, and this is the process for how she and I work together, so that it's not me in there, micromanaging everybody. Because I do really believe strongly, as now, in this kind of leadership role, I really believe that it's important to trust the people around you to do a good job and to give them the space in which to do that. So let them bring forward ideas that you might not have ever thought of. Let them say, okay, well, you want me to do X and Y in order to get to Z, but we can get to Z this other way. And how about, let's approach that. And so in terms of that journey from sort of academic through consulting to then kind of delegating and leading, I've learned that I really do trust the people that I work with. Again, you have to get it right. I mean, I've made some mistakes along the way, but if you get the team right and you trust them, it's amazing the sorts of things that can kind of bubble up and come to the surface. I mean, they're all far smarter than I could ever hope to be, and bring things to the table that I couldn't think of. And that's also, I think, in the post-academic world, that's also really rewarding, because it's easy to feel that only academics know how to think intelligently or rigorously about complex problems. And it's really rewarding to see, actually, you know what, like the marketing person who's thinking about, conversion rates from a free trial to a paid subscription, even though I used to think stuff like that was like crass or mechanical, there's actually a bit of an art and a science, and there's a lot of smart research into that. And that when you see people who are really good at it, and you recognize that domain expertise that may be different from yours, but it's just as valid, if not even maybe more than yours, is also really, really a rewarding piece that I couldn't have anticipated in advance.
And that, like, to me, that takes a certain amount of like an emotionally intelligent leadership too. Like they say that often the log jam or the bottleneck in a company is the leader, right? So like being able to kind of do that. I mean, it's something I'm still working on, and obviously whatever the thing that I'm running is much smaller than what you're running, but already you get that. It's really hard to say like, I actually do know how to do this. For example, like with digital marketing, like I know how to do this, but actually there is somebody who could do it a lot better, and not to mention I should just be doing other things. So like there's a kind of weird like transition into leadership that you kind of have to do, like a pulling back and a growing of yourself, I think, as you're going. So no, that's super interesting. I was going to ask you about, I want to ask you a little bit about startups, and then, oh shoot, we're running close to like out of time, but I have two more questions. I wanted to ask you a little bit of like nuts and bolts around startups for people who are interested and curious about it. I know there's a whole world that we can't get into, but just, I'd love to hear a few reflections on like what your advice would be for people who are interested in startups. And then the other the question of like having the tenure track job and feeling like you've got it made, and you never have to do anything again. And as you said, like that felt hollow. So I'm really curious kind of what your reflections on like purpose are now at this stage, now that you're in a totally different world, and kind of how you found yourself. So before we go to that one, the big existential question, what would you say to somebody who's thinking of a startup, who's in a PhD and has an idea, whether it's STEM or maybe humanities?
So there are a bunch of different ways I can answer the startup question. And for all of the attendees, if we do run out of time, so I'm on Twitter at Dr. Lindy. Absolutely, if you have questions and things like that you want to follow up with afterwards, like find me and I will absolutely answer those questions. So I'll flag that. And when this is recorded on YouTube, you can also find me at Dr. Lindy and ask me your questions and I'll answer them. The startup piece that I do want to tackle here is something that I think isn't talked about enough, and it's the financial piece. So often academics are really bad, and this is often quite typical, are really bad about knowing about finances, thinking about finances, talking about finances, understanding finances, and beginning to really sort of strategize a bigger financial picture and the sort of financial health of a person over a lifetime and all of those sorts of things. Often all we think about is like, oh my God, I have student loan debt and how do I get out of it? And that's the extent of the depth of the conversation. And that's obviously a very important and pressing concern. But then there are other kinds of financial pieces. And the thing about a startup, a technical startup, is it requires money. So unless you're able to do something based on sweat equity, in which case you're substituting time for money, so your time in your evenings and weekends from whatever your day job is to create this thing. Otherwise, you have to hire people to do it, or you kind of have to figure out their need, or you need to quit your job so you can allocate the appropriate amount of time to something. So it's a sort of time money thing. Now, if you don't have either the time or the money and you can't get it, then starting a startup is going to be futile. And it's very disappointing to say that. And so then the good part is there are ways in which you can get money. So in my case, I'll be honest, my spouse had a job. So if I was without an income, that was okay. I had a place to live. I wasn't going to be homeless. So that was okay. And it might be that you are living at home with your parents and they're able to support you. It might be that you have a partner who has a stable job. It might be that you got an inheritance and that's your nest egg. It might be that you've been able to, sell a car and it gives you a little bit of extra money. It may be that you're able to feel comfortable getting a startup cash flow loan from a bank. It may be that you have deep networks with friends and family investors or angel investors, or you want to go to the VC route. There are different ways in which you can find those resources, but I think you have to be really honest about that. And so, for instance, and I'm brutally clear here about the hard types of decisions you'll make. Like my husband and I had the hard conversation, which is we couldn't start a business and have a family at the same time. Like that, I could not start a startup, be without an income, do what's necessary to run that, and also have a kid. And given, because of the academy, like I was in my 30s, and that's the time that you have to do it if you're going to do it. And I'm perfectly happy with that choice. But I mean, the reason I flag that as my personal story is the details of your life will be different, but you do have to be really, really honest about what you can achieve and what you can't, because you may have you're unable to fund bringing that idea as a commercializable product to the market. Then it may just be best to be just an idea. All of it, like I have a number of, half-finished novels, but I'm not going to be able to bring them to market as a commercialized product because they're valuable to me. I think they're nifty, but I probably would never be able to turn them into something that's of publishable quality. So I'll continue to write those novels for fun. And it may be that your startup idea is a thing that you continue to tweak on the side until and unless the finances are different. So that's the piece that I wanted to say about the finances and that part of startup life. I mean, it's exciting and it's interesting, but I think you really have to know what you're getting into at the beginning.
That's really good advice. And also probably that'll take 2, 3, 4 times as long as you think it's going to take, right? to get.
Oh, absolutely. Everything will take longer and be more expensive than you think. I mean, that's, yeah.
That should be on a bumper sticker. It will be longer and more expensive than you think.
Yeah.
So, no, thank you very much. Those are some great thoughts on startups. And then I wanted to come back to that question of purpose and fulfillment. And, there's a lot of big existential stuff here that's weird to get into in the last 3 minutes of a podcast, but I'd love it if you'd give like a couple of reflections. Yeah, go ahead.
I can. So the things that motivated me as a scholar, so we go back, so I'm a literary scholar, I focus on CanLit and identity politics, which gives you an insight into the fact that I'm curious about the world in which we live. And I have questions about the world in which we live, and I want to contribute knowledge into the world in which we live. And those are the kind of key things as an academic that always motivated me. And I find that those are through threads now as an EdTech CEO. So our company is in the writing space and it's in education, and I'm still adding to and building to knowledge and making the world a better place and a place that has tools for critical thinking. And for me, I've always felt that language has the power to be the great equalizer. If we can name our emotions properly, so the difference between, if I feel like, oh, I'm upset, well, am I mad upset or am I sad upset? Am I embarrassed upset or am I hurt upset? They're all, and so the more precise we can be, the more control we have over our reality. And similarly, if we can hear a speech and we can kind of analyze how that speech is doing what it's doing to us, then we can start to engage more critically with the world in which we find ourselves. And I find now ever more so in this world of fake news and propaganda and, edutainment and the media that is all about entertainment. I find for me to feel that I'm working hard to help people think and write better, to make the world a better place, but also so they can achieve their dreams, so that they can be better, smarter, critically engaged people who have power over the world around them, and can use that power for good. And so that I get really excited about, because I really do, as much as I may be jaded about the professional academy, I really do believe in the power of education. And there may be different ways in which people can contribute to education, broadly speaking. Being a professor may be one way. I'm finding being an EdTech CEO is another way in which I'm contributing to education in a way that I am really happy about.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Lindy. Well, real quick, where can people find you online? You already mentioned it, but
Yep. So you can find me on LinkedIn. So I am the only Lindy Ledohowski, so you'll find me on LinkedIn, and it'll certainly say EssayJack is my job, and you'll recognize it's the right me. I think my hair was pre-COVID, so it wasn't quite so long in my LinkedIn picture. And then you can certainly find me on Twitter at Dr. Lindy.
Awesome. And essayjack.com is the website to check out. So thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation. There's so much here, and thanks again for joining me, Lindy.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So this is loads of fun. As I say, connect with me online. Makes networking easy.
Awesome.